So I guess we don't have a chair. I mean, yes, we have a chair here, but I mean, chair. But it's all right. Michael, if I violate rules, you call me, all right?
Regulating
Gary, we're working on that. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit about robot ethics, or some topics of robot ethics, but not ethics of design, development, and deployment, which I'm very happy we did touch on in several of our sessions. And this is more about some musings regarding moral properties of robots. And I'm going to look at two of those. Should robots have rights and protections? And that's mostly about governing human behavior towards robots. And the other one is about, should robots have obligations and prohibitions? And that's really about governing robot behaviors. So regarding the first, should robots have rights and protections? I'm going to say just a couple of points on this, and I think it's an interesting topic, and my first response is usually, come on. And then when I read some people's arguments and think about it, and I realize, you know what, we should definitely consider some of these questions. And not necessarily rights and protections as legal agents, but rather it's almost like to protect ourselves, to turn some norms on when we interact with robots. Now, some people have argued that's because robots have certain internal states, that they are becoming self-aware, self-actualized, as we saw, self-conscious, if they might feel something like pain. And I feel like, no, I don't think that's really the main argument. That might be possible, although I can't imagine why you would necessarily want to do this anytime soon, and even if it will happen, we will get into trouble earlier, before these internal states can, in a sense, be measured, and then rights and protections be installed on our minds with respect to the robots. I would more favor the second argument, that the social meaning of our behavior towards robots and the consequences of those behaviors, when children view our behavior towards robots, when we interact with each other in front of robots, and when somebody else sets an example of how to deal with a robot, that those social meanings might more subtly, without the consciousness of the robot, begin to influence, maybe negatively, how we interact with machines. And if they are our collaborators, our teammates, as many try to establish, then that could have serious detrimental effects. And my psychological prediction is that merely by interacting with robots and our natural empathic responses to even partially humanoid appearances and agents, people will endorse rights and defend robots' rights, not as a legal argument, but rather as a norm constraint on human behavior towards robots. So we don't actually have to have an argument about the property of the robot of having a right, but rather that the way we deal with it is as if it has a right, and then we enforce this behavior towards the robot. And that may happen without people ever worrying about whether the robot is conscious or not. And basically the argument would be that the shape of mistreating a human-like or even partially human-like agent will activate these kinds of concerns. And because of that, we will morally criticize each other. And there is actually already a little bit of evidence. And if this slightly uncomfortable video can illustrate that, some of you may probably already know this. So what's your reaction to this? All right, so similar videos have been coming out from Boston Dynamics, and I like Michael's comment, they're tone deaf. Even after the third of those videos and people's very strong negative responses on Twitter, YouTube, and so on, they still don't seem to care about maybe these slightly exaggerated empathic responses, but people cringe. And when I show this to students, you hear in the audience the discomfort of seeing something like that happen. But they're not defending their response by saying, oh, this is a conscious being. But rather, it's the very act that is being committed and what it says maybe about the person. And I can't help but watching this Boston Dynamics guy and his face, whether he might enjoy what he's doing or why he doesn't have some reluctance in what he's doing. So this is the argument not from a philosophical consciousness perspective, but rather on the perspective of the human. So very briefly, should robots have obligations, prohibitions? And here I just want to make 3 short points. First is, it depends on the robot's function and on its relationships with us, whether it should have certain obligations and prohibitions, because norms are foundations of human communities and roles are norms. So depending on the role that the robot plays in a particular community, and the community could be an N of 1 in one person's home, obligations and prohibitions have to be part of how we design this robot. If we don't do it, there will be plenty of norm violations and probably not very much adopting down the road. Second is capacity. We have to obviously work, and Gary Marcus argued this is very hard, to figure out what robots can know, learn, and deliberate about in that norm domain. And I'm not even talking about difficult moral dilemmas. It's just the rules of politeness and where you like your food to be stored and how you like your dinners to be greeted when you have a home robot, and how your kids should or should not be allowed to play for how long and so on. These are all norms, and you don't have to do trolley dilemma work on that. And we have done some work on several of those components and the capacities of robots for particular functions that robots should play. But really what I want to highlight is that learning norms, representing norms as action instructions, is actually doable. It might not be possible to learn a value like justice, but it is possible to teach and pre-program and mix the two together for robots to have actual norms that they then may obey. And we have started to build sort of norm networks of humans for certain narrow domains, and then think about how they could be computationally represented and put into a robot that it guides its action system. And I'm going to skip this. The TV show Extant is worth watching. Let's just say this. The final point is the sociality, that the reason why we are quite good in many circumstances of smaller communities in regulating each other's behavior is because we have the mechanisms of blame and guilt. The first one is we really care about others' approval. And if it is taken from us by being criticized, we care about repairing that. And we also typically care about relationships with others. And if somebody violates a norm, we typically want to repair that person's behavior and future behavior, but also maintain the relationship. And the power of others' criticism needs to somehow be also sticking to robots. Because if the robot makes a mistake and I complain, I don't want the robot just say, but Gary Marcus didn't program me the right way. I want it to say, yes, I want to learn. What did I do wrong? How could I improve? That's what we expect of partners, of teammates, and that's what would have to happen as well. And the other one, and this is the more complicated one, even though Ron Arkin talked about guilt, this is not exactly what I mean by guilt. But guilt is, in a sense, the anticipation of the potential for criticism. It makes you feel guilty to take the last cookie, even though nobody is yet watching. Because you imagine, you simulate that that would be a norm violation. And in the eyes of others, you criticize your own behavior. And we're capable of doing that because we are community members. And that's, I think, what the minimal requirement of a successful social robot should be. And I think this might be my final word. Successful and safe moral robots must be closely tied to their community in learning norms, in practicing and being criticized, in improving, and in anticipating other people's responses that then guide and regulate their behavior. Those are just the thoughts, and if you go to my website, you can see a bunch of these papers on which some of these thoughts are based.
Okay, I would like to address the topic of human-robot relationships. So robots, what we have heard today, will be becoming more and more pervasive in our society in different roles. And often, next to their functional requirements, they have socially interactive components. And research has shown that we humans are capable of bonding with all kinds of non-humans, like animals and even objects. And when these objects have like capacities, like lifelike abilities, and are endowed with human capacities, we are even more likely to bond with them. So robots in social roles, they will elicit social engagements, and this may foster human-robot relationships. And regardless of the ethical implications, these robots will become available in society once they are technically feasible of doing their jobs. So I was wondering, what are the ethical concerns when people believe they can foster meaningful interactions or relationships with robots? And what implications does it have for future generations who will be growing up with these robots? So the way we are interacting with robots appears to be very different from how we interact with other technologies. And this is mainly because, well, robots are embodied and they are physical, present in our environments. And at least that's how the user perceives it, is that the robot has senses and abilities to respond to us. So in a way, this will influence how people will interact with them, as we have proven today already. And this will probably magnify when robots become even more socially interactive in the future. So, well, in a sense, then interacting with a robot will be more and more likely as if we are interacting with other people. So my question was, how we will share our world with these new technologies? And is it possible to become friends with a robot? And is it ethical or desirable? So, well, robots that exist today, they are not sentient and they lack feelings. But still, we humans are interacting with them as if they do. And obviously, as Bertram pointed out earlier, that we need to well, evaluate these relationships based on the experiences from users, because every consequence following that will be based on how we believe or our own beliefs and experiences. However, this requires us to forget that robots are actually machines built on algorithms, and it requires the designers to create an illusion. So people may fall prey to accept robotic relationships without the moral consequences that normal reciprocal relationships have. And therefore, people argue that every benefit gained from the interactions with robots are actually consequences of deceiving people into thinking they are socially interacting with robots. So the question may be, is this deception? And is it ethically wrong? However, actually, we humans are all well, playing a certain role when we are interacting with others. What Bertram said earlier about the example of the girl asking the robot if she's pretty. Well, we find it acceptable to mask our own emotions or feelings when we're trying to avoid other people's feelings. So actually, the currency of human social interactions is a performance. And we have a tolerance or norm exceptions or context justifications in certain situations to lie, actually. And, well, we are all performing before, and now the robots will perform too. So what I actually want to stress here is that focusing solely on deception oversimplifies the ethical concerns with human-robot relationships. As long as the user is perceived to be served well and is satisfied with the robot behavior, there might not be a problem. However, do these imitated emotions and behavior elicit misplaced trust? So there's little doubt that people will be able to bond with robotic others, and they might even benefit from these relationships. However, robots cannot be our Aristotelian friends, since they cannot generally care about us. Thus we need to make sure that robots will not replace real humans. However, there are still some concerns. If people share feelings with robotic others, they may become accustomed to the reduced emotional range of these robotic systems. Oh, wait. And then the question might be, what will be the impact of human-robot relationships on our human relationships? Will they degrade our friendships with others? And the main question I have is, how will a future with all these robots change who we are, how we act and interact, not only with robots, but also with each other? Thank you.
Okay, so I want to take my comments to actually kind of challenge the whole sort of question of this panel, or topic of this panel, which is getting ethics right. I think it's more about doing ethics right. I think it's a little bit misleading to think that there's a right answer to any of these ethical questions. And I've been in far too many discussions where something like the trolley car problem comes up, and well, what's the right answer? And oh, hey, you know about ethics. Tell us the right answer, and we'll build that in. I think we need to think about what are we doing when we're doing ethics, or thinking about policy, or thinking about design, and what does it mean to incorporate values and ethics into systems. And it doesn't mean having the right answer, but I think it is about having the right process. And to come back to some things we've been talking about earlier today, and norms, it's a lot about norms. There's a lot of different kinds of norms, and ethics is the sort of norms that philosophers have talked about for a long time and think have moral weight, and there's lots of meta-ethical theories about where that all comes from. But of course we have legal norms, we have all kinds of cultural and social norms, and actually the way in which sociologists and anthropologists think about norms is subtly different than how philosophers think about norms. And it's also very different from how lawyers think about norms. There's obviously lots of overlap. There's ways in which these things try to replicate or represent one another. But they are somewhat different things. But they are ultimately about behavior. And I think a lot of the work in AI and robotics around norms focuses on empirical notions of norms, which is how do people actually do things, what do people actually observe, as is the case also in international law and norm forming, what do states actually do. But we also have, especially in philosophy, aspirational notions of norms. What should you do? What is the right thing to do in a deeper sense? And there's really different kinds of norms and values, and they come from different sources. So not just anthropological versus philosophical versus legal sorts of norms, but we have rules, we have laws, we have standards, and these come from radically different places and different communities, and they can be culturally different across international borders, they can be culturally different within communities, within a country, within a city, within a discipline. We have disciplinary differences of meanings of words, interpretations of what's right and wrong, and values. And of course, when we get into these questions of values, it's also questions about social justice, it's about questions of power and politics, and who gets to determine the rules, whose interests are served by shaping rules in certain ways. And to some extent, what we're trying to do, or what I hope we're doing when we're doing ethics right, is innovating around norms so that we create a better society that we want to live in, and that the technology enhances and enables that, and doesn't determine the world that we live in, regardless of what we desire or want. But then there's the question of who the we are. I'll jump ahead and come back to that one. So who's the we in that statement is I think, also very important to question. And I think that's part of the process. Who are the stakeholders? Participatory design has been mentioned in several talks today. I think that's a great way of incorporating multiple perspectives. It's a great way of bringing forth bias and things like that. But there's ultimately questions about whose values are we going to build into these systems, who gets to decide that, and at what stages of all of these processes is this happening. So I think you need this in the design phase of specific systems, but I think you also need these in policy discussions, in a myriad of different spaces. We don't want Silicon Valley alone to decide what the norms for the rest of human history should be based on robotic designs that come out of there. We need broader views of who can participate in that. And there's also, crucially, I think, dynamic sets of norms. Norms aren't fixed, which is this other problem of the kind of, well, we'll just find all the right answers of what robots should do, and we'll program that in, and we're done. Right? We're not going to have, ethical verification of robots the way that we have logical verification of programs. That's not that we just know or can formally prove all the right answers. These are going to evolve over time, and normative systems evolve over time. I think a good example of that is language. And we've already seen, historically, language moves over time. There's a certain stability to it, that we can understand each other, that we have shared meaning and shared understanding, but there's also changes. And actually, I think just in the last couple of weeks, the Modern Language Association changed their rule, so now we don't have to capitalize internet. And email no longer has a dash between the E and the mail, right? But people have been observing that norm for a long time, but it takes the regulatory sort of group quite a while to actually recognize and accept that norm. So we have lags between these different systems of people's behavior, the way that regulatory or standards commissions might think of things, and then how that might actually play into the design or implementation or behavior of actual systems in the real world. And these are all dynamic, right? So that norm used to be to capitalize internet or to put a dash in email. That changed at some point. It didn't sort of change at a specific point, right? It was gradual, and some people started doing it and others didn't. And there's moments where it's emergent, it's unstable, and it's not clear then which way it should go, one way or the other. And I think a lot of these questions about ethics in robotics are going to fall along the spectrum. Some things are going to be very clear. We don't want robots to hurt people. But we also have certain exceptions to that, and we maybe disagree about what the justifications are for exceptions to that rule. And similarly for deceptive robots or other kinds of robots. We may have different standards of things, and then there's going to be things that we have completely no agreement about at all. And so maybe we shouldn't endorse or build in certain kinds of norms and values if there's radical disagreement between the operators. But I think ultimately the process matters, and that's what we should really kind of focus on, not just getting the right answer, but how are we going about getting the right answer? And who is this answer for? Who do we represent when we build this system? Who does this system work for? And what are the implications of it? And I think this has to happen at the design phase, but also at the policy phase. And within all these discussions that might happen within ethical review boards or standards or regulatory committees, it's a non-ending process as well, right? So we don't just sort of get it right and then we're done. I don't think we'll ever sort of stop debating these things the way that we don't really stop ever debating politics. At the same time, I don't want to politicize robots as much as possible, because that's a surefire way to get people to disagree forever. But I think it is about a conversation. And in media theory, where I work, there's a lot of discussion about the public sphere, which is a kind of abstract notion about how the public debates norms and the rules of society. But I think there's very specific conversations that happen, and often the we that we talk about is our academic community. But it's also this community of people who are involved in industry. It's also the users. And I think it's broader than that. I think it's also popular culture. So the movies and the films and the television shows and the music and the books and the memes on the internet and all of these social media things that are going on, all of this is contributing to a cultural understanding of what robots are and what they could be and what we want them to be. And we need to pay attention to them. Even if they don't have answers, they're part of this discussion. And I think ultimately, it's more like a Rawlsian notion of ethics that has a reflexive equilibrium, right? So we can think about an objective answer if we don't have any position within the world. If we can stand outside of the world and say, well, this is what ethics should be in this model of the world, but once you're in that world, of course, you've got all the biases and you realize certain rules are going to benefit you as a specific individual in that society. And so what we try to do is approximate that with a veil of ignorance, but we sort of try certain things. Some things work, some things don't. But over time, through sort of iterative design of ethical norms, we establish certain kinds of stabilities. And those are the reflective equilibrium that we could find. And this is the process we should be engaged in, right? What can technology do for us? Try to do it with technology, find out it doesn't work. Maybe we see that technology could do this other thing. Do we really want it to do that? Try it, see if we want it after all. And so Okay, and I think in that sense, it's both aspirational and practical. So we need to be thinking about ethics that actually work, that we can get systems out there to do the things we want them to do, but I don't think we should lose the aspirational. We shouldn't just say, well, this is all we can get the technology to do, or all we could hope for, or all we need to do to get the self-driving car on the road. Maybe we should aspire to making the society better, and not just meet the sort of minimal requirements of replacing some other system with this new system that's just slightly better, but actually think about, well, if we could redesign the entire transit system, maybe there's better ways to do it than self-driving cars. All right, thank you.
Let's do this. Sit down. I'm just gonna turn video mute so we don't have to stare into the phone. Yeah. All right, fire on. Tosser.
So I love what you bring up about community and perception, and I have to say that it's also up to the robot manufacturers, so as well as the researchers. So in the case of Boston Dynamics, for example, and I literally was just talking to the owner of that 2 days ago. So they're owned by Google, as you know, and they don't have any. They're all prototypes of some of the most magnificent mobility, dynamics, balance in the whole world, and their motto is "Build it, break it, fix it." And so I thought maybe Mark should put this on his YouTube video so the public is aware that this is intended behavior. It has to be this way. There's no way you can get a robot into a real world, particularly if it's in the unknown of a real world environment, without bending it and tripping it and what appears to be whatever. So you have a robot community, robot manufacturers, and they don't care. That's not, the public really isn't their market, even though they have 20 million hits of whatever. And, you know, and I like the collaboration of researchers. So researchers, I think, also need to work together from ethics and psychology as well as mechanical engineering, because that balance is very key on both sides, as well as, but the main thing is public awareness. And right. So that's what, you know, I'm rooting for the robots, but I can't do that until the public is aware. And Boston Dynamics videos, while humorous or create a reaction, are not, that it's not an accurate depiction that exactly how robots have to do in beta testing.
Yeah, no, I agree, but I think there are creative ways in which a machine can challenge another machine. You don't have to necessarily have a human toss the robot with a big pole. You could have a machine do this. You could have a bench, a test bed area where robots are being challenged by various annoying little tripping, not human agents, but rather machine agents. And I think that many of those psychological responses that we have a hard time suppressing would just not come up. And you would still do all the same testing and show all the same break it, fix it, recovery. So you could do it, but you'd have to care about the response that people have to your YouTube videos. And that may require a couple more rounds of advertisement investment.
I'm just curious, have you actually written them? Sorry, hold on. Can you just pass the microphone?
Oh, sorry.
That was my only question. You know, have you actually? Oh, sorry.
Can you?
Sorry.
I gotta give it to her.
I'm ready.
Break it, fix it.
Why put more money into technology to have it when you have a human right there that has to use the robot?
This is a simple question. Have you actually written to Boston Dynamics yourself and caught them on this and asked them, you know?
There are thousands of YouTube comments.
They hate me all the time.
But are they answering any?
Michael has an answer maybe to your question.
I asked Raybert, who's the founder of the company, about this point blank, and he just shrugged it off. He just thinks, no, we're just showing that the robots are robust and people are being ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah, that's why tone deaf and
2 days ago.
vision deaf is the right word.
No.
We need a drone. Clearly, next year or in 2 years, we need a drone microphone. That. Yeah.
We'll have no need for a microphone. We won't be able to hear.
But where are you going to draw the line on this? I mean, I've actually seen newspaper stories written by parents complaining that their children are rude to devices like Amazon Echo. And I'm sorry, it's a hammer. It's a fancy hammer. If I want to be rude to a thing, why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I be mean to the voicemail when I'm frustrated? I'm not talking to a human. The human is not going to have bad feelings because I've vented my frustration. So where are you going to draw the line here, you know?
Well, you draw the line between your family and that family. That's the great thing about norms. Many norms have such context specificity that that family can decide that you treat a hammer, the TV remote, and your robot with the same respect. And in your family, you say, these are all machines, forget about it. And that's your right to set up in certain constraints many norms the way you want them. As you walk out further and further, you have less and less freedom and less right to just change the norms. And that, I think, is a key insight, and I think this is also how I take Peter's point, that we have to think about this. We can't have the abstract discussions just about moral robots, although I find them intriguing. We have to actually solve the particular issue. If you deploy that particular robot in a family, how do you handle the norm context right there? And can the machine pick it up? Can you pre-program it? Can you give it feedback? That's, to me, already a hugely interesting engineering and computer science problem.
It seems you could also look at it, though, as an interesting extension of the situation that prevails now with copyright, where you think you own a device, but the manufacturer has issued terms and conditions limiting what you can do with it. You know, like the iPhone. I mean, there's all sort. You know, you can't put your own software on it. You can't, etc. And as a situation, that kind of disturbs me to have something in my house that actually, legally somehow belongs to someone else, which is a separate issue.
That's a separate issue.
Separate issue from the one I first raised, but yeah.
Maybe can we? Rebecca has probably a legal point to add. Oh.
You wish.
Because I could just say.
So no, well, I guess you could cast it as legal. So Bertram, first, you had a point about robots having obligations due to their role. And I think there's an argument to be made for robots having rights due to their role too. In terms of thinking about training children, I like how this keeps coming up through all day through this discussion. You know, we certainly tell our kids to be careful with electronics because they're expensive, easy to break. But you know, my daughter throws her board book, which is one of the most stable things in the world that isn't plastic. I chastise her for it because books have value in my family, right? It's about learning and respect for learning, and so you treat books well. You demonstrate your respect for learning by treating books well. And I'm wondering if there's a rights and protections for robots out of a respect for maybe a role they're playing, a nurse or another role. Peter, way to make sure ethicists always have a job.
Job security.
There will never be a right answer. You need to keep asking. But I was wondering, and this was a bit of my question in your bias presentation too, how do you avoid locking in a given time period's bias or a given time period ethics into the code, into the algorithms that are making determinations? It seems to me that it's all very well to say we don't, I don't want to be controlled by the ethics. I'm glad that the ethics of the 1950s don't, run my life. I'm glad that the ethics of an earlier time period don't run my life. Well, I guess query the first statement, whether or not that's true. But whether or not they do or do not run my life, there's some disturbing stuff going around about men and academics that we were talking about. But how do you avoid that? How do you keep that flexibility in the norms?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's part of the challenge of the reflexive equilibrium. But I think this, and to go back to the last question that you had as well, which is different families having different norms. So, if we deploy this robot, should it respect books? Should it accept your norm to respect books? Okay, maybe that's something that's sort of family variable and that's acceptable. Should we allow it to kick the dog? maybe we just decide none of the robots we deploy are going to be allowed to kick dogs, even if that's the norm of the family, right? And how do we arrive at that? And of course, we shouldn't let the robots kill anybody, right? I think that's like a norm we can all accept pretty universally for a variety of reasons. And then there's others that are going to be more controversial or less controversial, and then it's a question of the specifics of that norm and that context of use, and do we have the authority as the manufacturer or as a state to sort of regulate that norm and see a public interest in regulating that norm, and can reach some kind of consensus within a society or within a community of use to accept that norm and observe it. Or if you get radical violation, this comes back to the paternalism. We can't also just impose all the norms that we want in the world through to robots if people aren't going to use them. Or use them the way they're supposed to be used. So I think there's limits on all of these sides, but you sort of build up these equilibriums over time through a lot of trial and error and conversation and discussion in the kind of public sphere of technological innovation.
So actually, to that question, I mean, if you look through history, the nature of social progress or social regression seems to rely on norms, the conflict between norms and the law, basically. Where, I mean, like Loving versus Virginia, you have the case of people violating the law for an emerging social norm. And I guess I'm a little bit scared at the concept of being paternalistic about which norms get established in robots, because that sets a very mass society norm, and could potentially have broader implications on the course of progress for humanity.
Sorry, I just want to understand what you're saying. You're objecting to putting hard norms, prohibitions into robots, like Peter said, for example.
I'm just concerned about like different cultures across the world have very different norm sets, and if you prescribe one norm set globally through some major manufacturer, how does that affect the course of progress? I mean, it could be very similar to government prescribing a norm that could be regressive or could halt progress.
I mean, I can only speak for myself. I wouldn't want to be part of a project that puts a fixed set of norms into robots and then ships them all over the world. I'm the complete opposite. I want to think about specific applications. If we are working together on a project in which we build a small, simple, but still reasonably capable robot for interacting with people who have beginning Alzheimer's, then I want to find out what for that domain, and maybe even for the people in the city in which we're going to deploy it, what norm system should we adopt, and then keep the system flexible in updating it. I mean, how do we do it with children? We're not just, when they're born, we then program them according to the international laws and all the norms in the world. No, we have them grow up in communities with all the flaws that entails. Namely, that in some communities you learn some norms that other communities don't accept. You have to learn that as well. You have to learn that different contexts, different communities demand different things of you. That can't all be pre-programmed. Some of it can be. And to me, this is the only way to go. Otherwise, you just have to lock in the robots into a very, very narrow application, and then that's it. There's no cloud learning among all the 1,000 robots, because they would learn the wrong norms. Because in Michael's family, they learned one norm, and in Julie's family, they learned another norm, and then those two norm sets come into my family, and I freak out. So I'm sort of a localist about that. That doesn't mean in any way that I expect my panel partners to be that way, but that's how I think about it. And that's a hard problem, but at the same time, it's a solvable problem with consequences that we have to keep updating and responding to.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I think exactly that people will just not accept a robot that violates their own norms. So probably it can be solved by self-regulation in that way, that certain countries, or maybe even smaller, like certain communities, won't just not accept a robot with the wrong rules.
I think it also comes to this distinction between values and norms, and we can actually agree on a lot of values at a high level of abstraction. You could look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights as a sort of global consensus around a set of norms. How do you actually implement those? What do those constitute? How do you actually, which algorithms or which robot designs are going to meet those? And that's, I think, where you start to see a lot of trade-offs. You see interpretations, you see different cultural norms about what constitutes exceptions to sort of violating or overriding those values or norms in specific situations. And that's where context and complexity starts to get big, and that's where you want flexibility, I think.
I'm glad to hear you bring in the word values here, because I'm afraid we're going to turn norms into facts. And it totally misunderstands one of the primary functions of ethics. Ethics isn't often about facts. Ethics is about the fact that we're navigating an uncertain world. And this becomes also the problem of having robots make these kinds of decisions. We don't have all the information we need. Some of the information we have is just plain wrong. We cannot calculate the consequences of the actions or the different courses of actions that we might take. So our language of values is often the language we use to navigate uncertainty. And even earlier, when we had Peter's norm versus Rebecca's norm, we were just saying, well, an aspect of it now has become a norm, but we're still in transition. We don't know what that norm means. But if we start talking about norms as if they are hard things, then we fall into that hole of talking about the world as if it can be lawful in all manners. And it can't. And that's why we have values.
Gary's, I think, did you catch him to raise his
Yeah,
hand?
Kate had her hand up.
Oh, okay.
We're at
Sorry.
time, so do you want to do both and then break?
No, we have time, yeah.
Okay. Let me just.
I was just going to say.
Wait.
I was just going to say, so just in the research that I've done recently, what I think is kind of so interesting, everyone's talking about this idea of localization, but I do think that there's plenty of examples. And so just as by way of background, these online speech platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, they use one set of norms or one set of rules for everyone globally everywhere. So if something is sexually impermissive content in Alaska, it's also like sexually impermissive content in Japan. And so these are, I think that's a really kind of important caveat to this discussion that we're having about how these robots and AI and algorithms will learn norms, because I, on one hand, think they can be incredibly localized, and then on the other hand, I do think there is some top-down elements that are happening, whether we realize it or not, that there are these private industries that are kind of exporting and creating or reflecting in rules a global set of norms that's happening.
But if I can just make a distinction, these are rules about what you do in the public sphere, what you upload to the public internet, whereas what you do in your family is not the same. So you can have localized norms in your family, and as long as you don't try to export them or come in conflict with the norms and the layers outside, that's very different than to say, what am I allowed to put up that everybody here can see?
Of course, I'm just saying that in the different levels of abstraction of what robots are, what AI is, what EV is, everything else, that question changes, right? So it's not always able to be localized question. And some other times we don't even have a say in it because these decisions are being made for us.
By others, yeah.
I was just contemplating Maartje's strong statement that we would never accept something that a robot that had norms that didn't agree with us. Or I don't know if you used the word norm or value, but I thought of at least one counterexample, likely counterexample, which is my values say don't snoop, and yet people accept all the time all kinds of these software systems that snoop upon them. Sorry, I wasn't speaking in the mic, but
No,
you probably
it was, yeah.
So it's probably more complicated than you suggested. I mean, probably people want their devices to be roughly commensurate with their own beliefs, but they'll, in exchange for free services or things like that, they're willing to suck up at least some discrepancy. And the horrible, if I may editorialize, thing that Congress just passed about ISPs getting permission to use people's data is an example. Probably most people won't do much about it. I will install a VPN myself because I find it, just too far from my values. But there is some interesting give and take where people will trade off in order for free services and things like that.
Also, in many places, they don't have a choice.
I mean, people often don't have a choice, and like people don't have to use Google. I mean, they agree to terms of service. They don't have to use iPhones, but they kind of feel as if they have to.
Yeah, but I think there is a slight difference when you're using the internet. Like your violation is not so clear when you're using it, whereas if the robot is in your home and is behaving in a way that you think is unacceptable, it's way more up close.
I mean, I guess I would count Alexa sort of nominally as a robot, and Jibo certainly. And, Jibo will be here soon enough, I guess. People.
We said 3 years ago.
They said 3 years ago. Soon enough. It's a variation on real soon now from Jerry Cornell. Anyway, I don't have an Alexa in my home. I don't like the always on thing, but lots of people are perfectly fine with it. And I mean, they think the benefit outweighs the cost.
Or they might think it might.
Maybe they're naive. I don't know. I mean, in Amazon.
That's my excuse. Yeah, I'm just naive. I don't believe that they're actually doing it.
Or they're in denial.
I would say it's even more complex. Like sometimes we expect our technologies to have higher standards or to enable us to realize norms that we fail to meet. So a lot of people install these apps to limit their time on social media or email and things like that because they lack the willpower internally to. And I think I need one of those apps myself.
Well, actually, one reason why the military is interested in funding some research on moral robotics is because they struggle with the fact that they have all these rules of engagement and international laws and human rights protections, and then their soldiers, in an alarming rate, violate these rules. And you can't easily get them, or you can't get them at all to basically snitch. They usually, way past events, they learn about these violations, but it's too late because they're not in the service anymore. And so the one question that they have is, what if a robot is around that has some stronger monitoring capacity that doesn't have the same loyalty obligations that a human soldier has? Could that robot remind people of those norms, of those rights of the villagers with whom they interact? Remind them of some of the maybe biases, the influence of affect and emotion on their performance? It's not a clear yes, but I think that's one of the reasons why they're interested in it, because they could actually make us slightly better. We in principle endorse those rules, but we sometimes fail for various reasons to uphold them or to abide by them. And maybe there are ways we sometimes remind each other, but maybe a machine can sometimes be such a reminding system as well. I find that to be at least an intriguing idea of sort of making us a little better without necessarily telling us to act very differently from how we normally act. It's like fulfilling our goals.
So just kind of maybe as a comment on what you just said, that reminds me of this really old term in science and technology studies called a technological fix, which is basically we find a problem that's often it's a social problem. And instead of kind of going back and figuring out, well, obviously we have this problem, people aren't behaving, they're not following the ethical rules that we have supposedly trained them to, might there be a problem in our social organization, in our training, in the potentially the conditions under which these people are working that is, causing this? We don't ask those questions. We go and say, like, let's figure out how to make some ethical robots that are actually going to remind us of our ethics. I mean, I think, in a sense, I would love to see some more also reflection. I'm not saying we shouldn't consider how to do ethical robots. Sure, we've opened that can of worms. Let's look into it, right? But I also think, why aren't we asking some of these other questions? Is it because they're too hard? Is it because they're too broad? Is it, but I really don't think we're gonna solve these problems by giving people an extra technology to observe them, right? They'll just put their dirty sock on it or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't speak for the military. My perspective on this is that they've probably tried many things over a long time. And there's a fundamental tension between the loyalty value and the commitment to the rules of engagement and other things. And these are true dilemmas. And typically the soldiers err on the side of keeping loyalty up for various reasons. And you can't easily solve that problem, I think. So you introduce something else that also has other benefits of having, for example, a partner in surveillance and not risking human life just by checking out whether something's in a decrepit building. So there are various ways, of course, in which other functions are also assigned to this robot. But that's an additional possible, maybe more subtle aspect that isn't going around and telling you, Peter, you did this wrong, Maartje, this is not good what you're doing here. That would not work. But the mere presence and maybe sometimes reminder or bringing up a conversation or a question might actually be enough. It's not a fix. It's more like a nudge. And you still rely on people doing what they're supposed to do. You're not doing it for them. That's, you know.
But I would say there's also an opportunity there, right? So it is a social problem, and there's a lot of social problems. And there's, I think, a desire to solve them with technology in a sort of TED Talk fashion, which I don't think is going to work. But I think there is a lot of value and opportunity in being able to shift the discussion onto technology and away from like entrenched politics. And I think the labor question is a good example of this, in which somehow in our political framework in this country today, we can't talk about wealth inequality in the actual political public sphere. It doesn't come up, you know. But we can talk about unemployment through automation, right? Which is not necessarily the cause of the underlying problem, nor will solving it or taxing it or solve the more fundamental social problem of wealth inequality. But at least we can start talking about it and start realizing in many more fora that, oh, actually there's this deeper problem that we're skirting around. And I think, you know, in the military context too, right? It's not simply to correct the single individual, but to recognize these are values that should be within the professional militaries and international armed conflict, and they're failing, and we're not talking about how they're failing.
Mm-hmm.
And now we can talk about it because we start talking about specific technologies, and that's sort of, because it's not a specific person, it's easier to do that.
And there are already like a bunch of examples that objects can steer our behaviors. A speed bump will slow us down when we're driving. If you put ice somewhere, we won't steal the cookies from the jar in front of it. So there are a bunch of examples that we can actually influence our behaviors with very simple things. So maybe robots can too. I don't know.
Reactivating norms. So can we really end on time? Is that really? Wow.
That's scary.
That is scary. We're following the norms way
regulated.
too closely. Are there any last questions? Well, we have food and drinks out there, so there's an obligation to take in some of that. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It was really fun to get all these perspectives, and we hope we can do this again.